I'm excited for you to learn the information this week. This is actually one of, I would say, probably my favorite elements of being a special education teacher, and that's providing resources and support to families. And so this week, we're going to talk about wraparound services, or sometimes you know them as agencies. Oftentimes, when you're in the transition phase in the process, you will know them as agencies. But they have been referred to in the past as well as wraparound services. And what that means is that we wrap all the community around our students to ensure that they have successful movement through their progression of education and their progression essentially to adult life. And so what I've done to this week is to create for you a little presentation about the key elements of wraparound services. So there are several different components that we're going to be discussing today, but the biggest thing that we want to remember is that our whole goal of wraparound services is connecting students and families to the supports that they need that are within their local community. Kinzer in 1982 was one of the first that identified the seamless system of care. And what that means is that we provide community-based supports to our young individuals with disabilities, but we base it on their individualized needs and on their strengths, because we want to make sure that we're using the right resources to get us where we need to be. We want to ensure that those are culturally competent, and we also want to ensure that families are involved in every step of that process. It is a team-based approach, and we should all work together. One of the things that you will see as you enter the transition phase is the collaboration and the continuity of services within that process. And that's essentially what it means, is that every single person works for the coordination of the best transition plan possible. And that isn't any different at the elementary or the middle school ages either. We have to remember that we have to have flexible approaches to funding, because not every service is free and not every service is eligible to a certain person. And so I'm going to talk about that throughout this presentation. We also want to remember that we have to have an unconditional commitment to ensuring that our students progress through life and transition effectively. And that means we have to connect that seamless system of care. We have to remember that we need to ensure that plans and goals are set regardless of whether it's in the school setting or whether it's with an agency. And then we have to measure those outcomes to ensure that our students get where they need to get. And that obviously the end result is success. The first thing that we're going to talk about is community-based supports. So a lot of supports are available within your local community. Getting to know all of those resources where your families live is very vital to the success of your youth. If we don't know what's available, we cannot refer them out. We cannot provide that seamless system of care or that wraparound service. We need to ensure that interagency collaboration occurs, and that means that agencies are all working together for the benefit of the child. That means that we have to have a collaborative framework in which we understand who's there, what resources they provide, and what services they provide. But then we have to blend that with a collaborative service delivery model. And what that means is that it's not us as educators just acting alone, that we provide support through Nebraska VR. We provide support through Department of Health and Human Service. Everybody has a niche. Every agency has a niche, and they're often grant funded. So that in that collaborative framework, we learn exactly what supports are available to children from each agency. Then in that service delivery, we work together to ensure that those are given out. A collaborative framework is so important to develop within our schools. It has to be something that we have as a cultural component. And what that means is we have to identify our contacts at our different agencies. We have to take the effort to go meet them. I came into my current ESU as the transition coordinator. And I came in from out of state. I didn't know anybody within my local community. But within about 6 months, I had built multiple relationships with many of those agencies. And I was able to pick up the phone and call them by name. We have to make sure that we know exactly who's at that agency. We have to build strong relationships with those members so that if we need something or we need to at least know where a student can go for something, all we have to do is pick up the phone and call. And that happens a lot in the area where I work, where I will say, you know, I don't know if they provide that, but let me call them and I bet they will tell me exactly who provides that. So it's building that little framework that exists and building a network almost. And then we have to invite agency personnel to the students' IEP meetings as needed. Even though agencies are not required to be invited until the age of 16, what we have to remember is that it is important for our students to have them there if we need them. If we are going to introduce a service, we might either need them on the phone, we might need them on Zoom, or we might need them at the meeting to explain that service. One of the things I did as part of my project is I had videos about the services that the agencies provided, and then teachers could play that at their meetings if needed. Because we have 21 different districts and we cover 14,000 square miles. It is not possible for an agency to always be at a meeting, but we can think of creative ways to build that framework. Then we have to remember that we have to refer the student to the appropriate agency. One of the most frustrating things for families is that we say, oh, I think they can do that over there, and we send them there. And then they get there and they're like, oh no, you have to fill out this application first, you've got to go over there. And oftentimes our families will just not follow through because there's 5 or 6 different steps and they don't know where to go first. So we have to remember that building that collaborative framework is something we should be involved in, and we should be helping make those connections. Then we have to remember that we have to be part of that collaborative service delivery. We have to be the link to the agency. So if you imagine yourself as a chain link fence, we're the links that kind of hold all those other pieces together. We have to provide resources, connect the families, and we have to follow up on the referrals. We have to remember that agency development, collaborative framework development is a confusing process, and we tend to be experts in our field. Parents are not always experts on what agencies are out there. And so sometimes they may become overwhelmed or they may not know how to continue on with that referral. So following up with them and making sure that they have all the questions answered that they need answered, and that we even can help them do that process. In our service unit, we actually have a transition coordinator, and she is a social worker. And one of the key reasons that we have her is so that she can be that connection and that link. Because we have to be really cautious about things. She ensures that all of the confidentiality elements are met. She makes sure that we have sharing information if we're going to talk to an agency. But in this collaborative service delivery, we have to keep confidentiality as a key element. We can call an agency and ask if they have a service, but we cannot violate the student's privacy by saying, I have a student who has this disability, I have a person who, or using their names. So we have to remember that we can give some disability related information as long as it's not student specific and identifiable. We have to make sure that we are very cautious and that we don't just send an IEP over without a consent form signed in this model. We are there to protect our families and to help our families connect. And if we cannot be that link, then things are much more difficult in this process. And in that last component, I kept mentioning the word family because family partnerships are so critical. We have to help them make connections. We have to ensure that the school, the agency, and the family come together and work together for the best interest of the students. Families are not always open and willing to accepting agency supports and services, but we can be that link to help them. We have to use a strength-based approach. We have to include families in the discussions and the connections. We can't just assume that someone needs something. We have to ask them and see if they are willing to access that service. We have to make sure to keep the conversation student-centered and not issue-centered. Oftentimes, people can feel insulted if we say, well, you know, I know that you're having a financial hard time. We're going to connect you with this food bank. We have to be really cautious about that and just say, you know, I know there's something that he might need over there, and I bet he can get that. And it would make life a lot easier for all of you. And he would be able to get his lunches and components for his lunches. So we have to not be accusatory when we offer these services. Here in the panhandle of Nebraska, we have a lot of prideful people, a lot of people who don't necessarily believe in taking community resources and services and using government funding. And so we have a lot of parents who do not want to refer their children to the developmental disabled services within the state. And so we have to remember that we have to bring that in slowly, because we insult them by even offering a governmental funded service to them sometimes. And so it's not to say that they don't want the best that's for their children, but we have to remember that it's not issue centered, because that can insult them. So we have to be really cautious. We have to acknowledge culture and language components. And by culture, I seriously even mean socioeconomic culture. And that might mean the people who are prideful, who don't like to take government support. That's a culture and that's a belief, or maybe even a political aspect. But we have to be respectful of that. Another thing we have to be respectful of is religion. Different religions can take different services, but other religions cannot. Different cultures accept service differently, different ethnicities accept service very differently, and the language barrier is always there. So if we use that strength-based approach and come at it from that perspective, we can overcome those cultural and language components. We have to facilitate connections and not force them. I think it maybe took us about 3 or 4 years for one family to finally have their youth apply for developmental disabled waiver. And it wasn't, like I said, because they didn't want the best that was for their child. It's just they were able to provide everything that was needed right now. And it was very difficult for them to look at a future where they were not involved. And so we have to remember that there's a lot of other emotional components that come into play with that. We have to respect the family decisions. If they tell us that is not something they're interested in, we could maybe revisit that in 6 months or a year, but we do not constantly force it. It isn't that the parents don't want the best interests for their child. We have to ensure that we are respecting them enough to listen for that component. And that really ties into the family's needs. And we have to remember that not every agency and not every resource can match for a child and their family. Requirements are going to vary for application processes and for acceptance and all of that. Sometimes they're age requirements, sometimes they're different disability requirements, and sometimes they have income requirements. And so we have to remember that it's not a one size fits all for agencies. We have to build that framework to understand what is the requirement for that particular agency. We have to research agencies and their requirements. Many have age requirements. Some only handle early childhood. Some handle only transition age. Some handle only elderly ages. So we don't want to make assumptions that that agency will be able to serve them. What are the income requirements? Some will only handle poverty level individuals. Some will handle all. So we just have to remember that we've got to check that out so that we don't send a family and get them frustrated and then they stop wanting our services. Our service is only available to specific disabilities. If we look at the national societies that are set up per disability, I know there's a Rett Society, and they will only serve individuals with Rett syndrome. and they provide funding and finances for that. We have a local one called Golden Halo, and that foundation will support individuals with significant disabilities. But a student with a learning disability in their family could not access that service. So we have to know that. Are they available only to specific disabilities? Is there a waiting list? I don't know about you guys, but our vocational rehabilitation and our Department of Health and Human Service DD waiver is actually on a waiting list. Housing is about, it was a 4 or 5 year waiting list. So you have to know that too, because even if you know they're going to graduate at 21, if there's a 5 year waiting list, we need to make sure to get them connected to those wraparound services by the age of 13 or 14. So then we have to think about, does a student automatically qualify, or is it an application process? Some of the application processes typically relate to financial agencies, but some of the other ones who are open access, a student can walk in and just get services. So that's a good question to ask them. What documents are necessary to apply? One of the most frustrating things for families when I first started as the transition coordinator was that we would sit down to do the DD waiver application or the Social Security application, and they wouldn't have all of the medical records because I didn't realize that I needed to tell them to bring those. So making sure that we know what they need to apply and to have it handy is really important. Then we have to ask ourselves, is there a physical location for the agency? Because some of these agencies have 5 locations and you don't really know where to go to apply. So it's important for us to actually have the application location or the place where they would go in and actually get that service so that they don't become incredibly frustrated. And then, are they fee-based? I know for us, the DD waiver, if a family has a certain income level, then they have to pay to get access to that service. Some of the other services are also pay for access. Our Panhandle Public Health Center does some genetic testing, but I believe some of it's a paid service and some of it's not. So you just have to know if they're a fee-based service. Knowing all of these answers is going to build that framework for us and really get that family connection going with the funding, and they won't go to 3 wrong places to finally find the 4th right one. So it is important to ask those questions and to learn what agencies are within your local community. And it's also important to know if the organizations and the agencies develop plans. Almost everybody has a plan for everything. Here we have a vocational rehabilitation plan, we have an IEP plan, we have an independent living plan, we have a plan from the counselor at school, the DD waiver is going to have a plan. Everybody has a plan and parents have to meet. So even though we think, oh, they have one IEP meeting a year, they might be meeting with VOCA Rehab once a year. They might be meeting with DHHS once a year. They may be meeting with whatever other agency they actually meet with. If they're using, we have the League of Human Dignity here, which allows families to be able to provide some respite care for their own children and get paid for that, but they have to have meetings for that. Maybe they have the Respite Care Network of Nebraska that they have to support them, and so they have to have meetings for that. So we have to remember that bringing all these plans together and bringing these components is going to make it way less confusing for parents and students. So we just have to make sure that we're aware of the plans that they have in place so that we know what services will be best for the student. But it is so critical for us to provide these wraparound services for our students, regardless of what age they are. If we provide them in the early years from 0 to 3, 3 to 5, and then Part B, which is your kindergarten to 21, if we provide those services for that, then we should ensure that we know our wraparound services for all of those ages. So always think about what community-based supports and services are available. How can we partner with families to make sure that those are all accessed in a proper way? And what is the funding and eligibility requirements so that we don't offer families the wrong the wrong access in the beginning to get them frustrated. And then we just have to remember, what's the growth strategy? Are we making sure that the whole purpose of all of these services is to help our students grow and to have access to the best things possible? So one of the things I want to leave you with on that is that it is so important. I think this is probably one of the most important parts of the job, because when you're sitting around a table with about 15 people, and about 6 of them are agency staff, it's really good to understand and know where they come from, because each of them is going to speak a different language. And so I encourage you guys in this week to really use the time, and especially your CFE experience, to explore what you have in your local community or to locate those resources. It never hurts to have a resource guide. I believe I shared with you the resource guide that I created for the transition age group for all of our 21 districts. That's an example of some way you could organize your resources. But if you had something like that for families, then they would be able to have easy access and they would know where they could go if they needed a certain resource. So as you enter this week, I hope that you guys start to explore those things and that you enjoy learning about those particular resources. Thank you and have a super week 4.